Hello, welcome to Cerebral Faith Live. I'm Evan Minton. Tonight we're going to be having a debate between Caleb Jackson and James Fodor. Caleb Jackson wrote Undead, investigating the most famous miracle in the history of the world, or something like that. I should have pulled up because I'm terrible at remembering subtitles. And James Fodor has written a book criticizing William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith called Unreasonable Faith. And before we get started, I just want to say I want to apologize for not giving the usual shout outs to the patrons last week. I usually do that, and I forgot when I had Nick Peters on and we were talking about preterism. So I'm gonna try to remember to do that this week. But yeah, we're just gonna jump into it. And by the way, speaking of patrons, if you would like to support this ministry financially, go to www.patreon.com/cerebral faith. So here are our debaters, Caleb Jackson and James Fodor. Hello, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Hello.
Hi, good to be here.
So the debate is, as everyone knows, because it's in the title, it's about the resurrection of Jesus and whether it's fact or fiction. In other words, is this something that really occurred in space and time, or is this just something that some people made up and wrote down, or maybe were mistaken about? Is it history, or is it not history? And that's Caleb is going to be taking the affirmative. It is fact, and James is going to be taking the negation, that it's fiction, that it's not history, that it did not occur. Now, both debaters are going to have 15 minutes to give their opening statement. Of course, if they don't need 15 minutes, if they get done before then, that's fine too. But 15 minutes is like the cap. We've got 7 minutes for both debaters for a rebuttal, 20 minutes of cross-examination, and then you guys watching this, you will be able to give your questions to both debaters in the live chat, and our debaters will respond to those. And that period of live chat questioning will also be 20 minutes. And each debater will have 5 minutes closing, making this episode of Cerebral Faith Live the usual hour and a half. So, want to say hello to some of you people. Hello, Travis Lee. Hello, Barely Protestant. Harambe is the third debater. Yeah. Kendrick Kwan says, I'm looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to this too. James Fodora, Digital Gnosis. Yeah. So anyway, let's get started. Caleb, you have the floor for 15 minutes. Oh, wait, hold on. Let me grab my phone so I can keep track of.
I'll wait till he gets his phone.
I should have already had this on hand. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're good. Are we gonna get like a minute warning or something, or is it just?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me pull up my timer.
I don't think I'll be the full 15, but you can never. It's always safe to have some kind of boundary for that, right?
Yeah. So 15 minutes starting.
You want me to go ahead and start? Do you want me to go ahead and share the screen and stuff that we're doing?
Oh yes, yes. Yeah. This the screen share. Yes, we're going to be having PowerPoint this time.
Google Slides, but yeah, close enough.
Yeah, Google Slides. It's like Coca-Cola here in the South. Here in South Carolina,
no.
everything is Coke. Doesn't matter if it's Pepsi or Dr. Pepper. It's Coke.
Yeah.
So the same applies to PowerPoint.
Gotcha. Are you able to see this?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Just give me the go whenever you want me to start.
Okay, and start.
All right. Thanks everybody for being here and tuning in. This is a really exciting debate. And so today's discussion, or tonight, depending on which time zone you're watching this in, is about whether or not Jesus rose from the dead and whether the resurrection is historical. Now, I will be defending the affirmative position. The best explanation for the facts surrounding Jesus of Nazareth, both in history and the present day, is that he was raised from the dead by God. I shall argue two primary points. One, that the historical evidence is best explained by the resurrection hypothesis, and two, competing naturalistic theories, in this case James's RHBS model, lack explanatory scope, explanatory power, and predictive power. Now, for the first point. The evidence of the resurrection comes in two forms, historical and modern. Let us start with the former. Many apologists would start with a bottom-up approach, beginning with a presentation of, quote, minimal facts, and then concluding the resurrection is the best explanation. I, in the vein of figures like N.T. Wright, James Dunn, and J.P. Holding, will do the inverse. First, we should ask why the earliest Christians believed that their teacher had been raised from the dead, a notion contrary to prolific Jewish eschatology of the time. Why not say Jesus was merely a ghost? Why conclude that he had been bodily raised instead of everyone being raised at the end of time? This question is made clearer by the gospel narratives. Jesus convinced his followers through physical demonstration over repeated encounters. While skeptics are inclined to reject these details as legendary, I argue that these very details act as necessary factors to explain the origin of the Christian belief. 5 historical scenarios seem to arise. 1, an empty tomb with no appearances, which would just lead to belief that Jesus' body probably went missing, something that Mary Magdalene suggests to the gardener in John 20. Second, visions without an empty tomb, belief that Jesus is a spirit. This is similar to in Acts, where Rhoda believes that the spirit of Peter is an angel or a ghost, but that's not necessarily analogous to a bodily resurrection. 3, visions with an empty tomb, which is the closest to James's model, is belief in Jesus' assumption and exaltation. We can look at stories, for example, like the Testament of Job or the ascension of Moses and other parallels with people like Elijah to show that missing bodies aligned with visions of the dead would lead to belief that the person was vindicated in heaven, but this is not analogous to resurrection. This was also associated with eschatology in the end times, when the people who were assumed to heaven would return to earth, meaning that eschatological expectation combined with an empty tomb and visions would probably lead to belief in exaltation and assumption, not resurrection. 4, physical appearance with no empty tomb. This would lead to belief in misidentification, somewhat similar to the belief that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead because of the bodily nature of it, but not the same thing as an eschatological resurrection, more in line with Lazarus's temporary revivification. And 5th, and what I would argue is the best explanation, physical appearances with an empty tomb, which would lead to belief in bodily resurrection. This is the explanation that our sources, primarily the Gospels, give us, among with other places. Now, again, given these 5 scenarios, option 5 has the greatest explanatory power, as it explains why the earliest Christians would believe in bodily resurrection, in contrast to more common ideas like ghosts and heavenly assumption. It is also consistent with the sources given to us in the gospel records. Some, including James, may not be willing to grant the vertical details that sound the gospel narratives, but by rejecting these details, one is removing a necessary prerequisite needed to generate such a belief. And I think Origen, in his treatise against the critics of Christianity, puts it in a very interesting way, where he says that, look, Thomas didn't disbelieve that a person could be seen from the dead, but he did disbelieve that a person could be touched. You know, he says here that he did not think it impossible that the soul of a dead man could be seen, but he did not yet consider the report to be true that he had been raised in a body, which was the antitype of the former. And therefore, he did not merely say, unless I see, I will not believe, but he said, unless I put my hand at the nails and lay my hands on his side, will I not believe. Now, again, this does not prove the historicity of the Johannine story of Thomas, but it does show similarities and verisimilitude with what we would expect people of the time to say. So the modality of the appearances in companion with an emptied grave, a historical fact that James concedes for the sake of argument, presents a very interesting set of facts to be explained. Yet it is not historical evidence alone that grants the Christian warrant in his belief of the resurrection. History is, after all, a minutiae of guesswork and missing details that we can only speculate in piecing together. The resurrection advocate, after all, does not only believe that Jesus was risen from the dead 2,000 years ago, but that the living Christ is still alive and active today. We must ask, does Jesus still appear to people today, and how does this affect the resurrection hypothesis and its naturalistic competitors? An often under-discussed element of the resurrection is the fact that the appearances of Jesus still occur today. Granted, many of these can be deemed hallucinatory, yet others possess veridical features that cannot easily be dismissed as delusions of the mind. Many visions derive information that a person was previously unaware of. Sometimes these occur to people unfamiliar with the faith. One case in point, Marlene Kleeps was a teenager endowed with very severe condition of cerebral palsy, rendering her legally blind, a cripple endowed to a wheelchair, and suffering from speech impediments. She was cared for by the Mayo Clinic in the 1980s, where she was going to move to a nursing home for advanced care. One day, Marlene had a vision of Jesus appearing to her, who told her that she would be healed on March 8th. She was shown in a vision a man in a pinstripe suit. On March 8th, a pastor in a pinstripe suit was called to pray for Marlene. The girl stepped out of her wheelchair for the first time in years and began to run around the building, with her atrophied muscles recovering and her spasms ending. Her eyesight was also healed, with Marlene going from legally blind to not even needing glasses. Medical records from the Mayo Clinic, as well as a testimony of her doctors and nurses, indicates that her recovery after her vision and prayer was medically inexplicable. Cerebral palsy, after all, has no cure. Here we have a case of a severely disabled person being quickly healed from an incurable condition after receiving a vision of Jesus, with the vision predicting the exact date of the healing and the pastor who would be involved. This is not overly surprising on the resurrection theory, because if Jesus is still alive, he could still perform faith healings as he did during his earthly life. But if Jesus is dead, how strange is it that such phenomenon would have any vertical impact at all outside of mere psychosomatic optimism? Appearances of Jesus not only occur to believers. Non-Christian cultures experience similar phenomenon that leads to massive conversions. Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, and other non-religious people recount seeing Jesus appear to them, often with very limited knowledge of Christianity prior. One survey by Fuller Theological Seminary School of World Mission found that around 1 in 4 conversions of Muslims to Christianity involved a vision or dream of Jesus. This is also true for many Hindus and Buddhist countries. The Jewish New Testament scholar Hugh Montefiore converted to Christianity after having a vision of Jesus in his youth, despite claiming to know nothing about Christianity prior. Even Origen, again, mentions many similar conversions occurring in his day. He says in the highlighted part, many have been converted to Christianity as if against their will, some sort of spirit having suddenly transformed their minds from a hatred of doctrine to a readiness to die in defense, and having appeared to them either in a waking vision or a dream of the night. So again, this is not just limited to a certain group of people, but this is expanded outside. In fact, this is very important because the details only add on to these historical factors. Fodor need only apply a hallucination hypothesis to the 12, and Paul, an outsider, but amplified this number by millions. Paul is not a mere outsider. There are countless well-evidenced examples that parallel his conversion post-mortem. James himself admits that the psychological prerequisites in this model cannot possibly account for accounts like this. In fact, he says, quote, "The thing is, if Jesus appeared to these different people and they had written that down, then I think I'd be a Christian right now, because the evidence for that would be so much better than the evidence we currently have. And my explanation, which is partially in hallucinations, wouldn't be able to account for it, would it? There's no way my explanation could account for how we'd have contemporaneous accounts in like 5 different regions of the world that had little to no contact with each other, especially those who didn't have any concept of anything like a Jewish Messiah. My account would just be torn to shreds by evidence like that." Now that I've presented positive evidence from my position, let us now turn to a critique of James's alternative theory, the RHBS model. This summary argues that it is historically plausible that Joseph of Arimathea reburied the body of Jesus for a number of possible reasons, that individual hallucinations occurred to some of the apostles' women, that cognitive dissonance and memory biases distorted details over time, and that socialization pressured dissenters to confirm with groupthink of the early church. Let me first grant that James's critique of the resurrection is quite superlative in comparison to most other skeptics. He is far more persuasive than Ludemann, Carrier, Ehrman, and the like. That being said, I will still argue that his model falls short in the following ways. First, the reburial is ad hoc due to the time frame and condition of the tomb. It would be inconvenient for Joseph to move the body in the dark when such a task could have waited till morning. After all, what he was doing was not illegal. Nor would Joseph leave his stone unrolled to expose his tomb to animals, robbers, and elements. Cleanliness concerns would infer that the tomb remained shut when not in use. Even if the corpse was buried in a criminal graveyard per the Jewish Mishnah, this would necessitate Jesus' family burying the bones a year later, meaning the location would need to be known and the body being able to be identified, as we see in those Jewish sources. Now, the hallucination and socialization elements of the model are also problematic in certain ways. Putting aside the aforementioned argument that hallucinations would not lead to a belief in resurrection, a hallucination will almost certainly conform to Jewish descriptions of the resurrected body. The Old Testament, in places like Daniel 12, presents the resurrection as luminous and glorified. Had the 12 seen Jesus in a glorified state, they surely would have preserved the traditions for apologetic reasons. Yet the traditions we have are far more alien and seemingly not based on scriptural motifs or expectations. Therefore, whatever the disciples saw probably was external to them, not instrumental and internal. We could lay this out in the following way. Premise 1, if there were glorious appearances of Jesus that were hallucinations, the church would have preserved them. 2, the church did not preserve the glorious appearances. 3, therefore the appearances were not glorious. And then we can fall from the appearances were not glorious to the appearances were likely not consistent with expectation of the time. Lastly, we can talk about cognitive and memory biases. Now, James is correct that memory can indeed be false, and there are many examples of that. But granted, comparing modern parallels to ancient cultures where oral tradition was much more common is a bit trickier. But even in cases of false memory, these usually occur under certain conditions. It's usually during a crisis event when things happen quickly, or when a weapon or a dangerous object is involved, like a gun at a robbery, for example. But typically, these don't apply to things that are repeated over long periods of time. For example, if one to read Acts and believe that Jesus appeared to people over 40 days, over long periods of time, repeatedly and continually to relieve their doubts, then this would be much more difficult to explain as merely cognitive biases. And we know this because we, of course, are able to discern what is and what is not a false memory. We have to have some kind of criteria. No one thinks that we are all hallucinating right now because this doesn't fit in with some of these criteria. So, to conclude, when we compare the models, the resurrection hypothesis makes better predictions and better entailments than the non-resurrection hypothesis. The resurrection hypothesis entails an empty tomb because it's bodily resurrection. If the body was still in the tomb, it could not be a resurrection by definition. We would predict that Jesus would have various appearances because the point of the resurrection is its theology itself. If Jesus raised and didn't tell anyone, it would not be significant. And of course, we'd expect him to appear to his disciples, but we'd also expect him to appear to outsiders as well because of conversions. For example, we may ask, why do we think Jesus would appear to Paul? And yet when we see that in hindsight, it becomes much more clear. Paul, as a Gentile, was perhaps the most influential person in Christian history, and is certainly responsible for a huge number of conversions. Seeing this in hindsight makes it obvious why someone like Paul would be converted in the first place and why Jesus might choose to appear to him. It also predicts that formation of new beliefs would happen because it is itself a unique event. And so a unique event would carry unique beliefs. This does not mean that every unique belief necessarily has to be a miracle, but it does mean that we need to ask why unique beliefs formed under certain conditions. And point 4, which is something that I already mentioned, it would not be as surprising if this continued today, whereas under the non-resurrection hypothesis, it would be very surprising. Under the non-resurrection hypothesis, it's less likely the body goes missing. It's not impossible. There's certain ways it could happen, but it's not at least entailed in it like it would be in the resurrection hypothesis. We wouldn't expect that many appearances to non-Christians, so you could maybe pick a few, but the more number of people you add, the more difficult it gets. 3, it wouldn't necessarily lead to belief in a new in resurrection, given the Jewish background that we know. It's more likely this would believe to heavenly assumption or spirits, but not necessarily resurrection, because an empty tomb with visions and eschatological expectation would be perfectly in line with heavenly assumption akin to Moses and Elijah. And modern Christian miracles and visions would also be extremely unlikely to happen with evidential and medically documented cases. So with that, I would like to conclude by saying that the resurrection hypothesis has far greater explanatory power, explanatory scope is what that second one's supposed to be, and predictive power. That concludes my time, and thank you so much.
All right. So you stayed under your time pretty well. And so, James, it is now your turn. Bring up your PowerPoint if you have one.
Yes, just a moment here. Oh, what's this? Right, can you see that okay?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to start the timer now.
All right, thanks everyone, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, well, this morning for me. So what I'm going to do in my time is to present my thoughts on the resurrection facts, as I call them. So these are some of the key items that require explanation, I think, from a skeptical or from whatever perspective you come to the table at. And before I do that, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about the notion of an explanation and what counts as a good explanation. I'm going to talk about the RHBS model that Caleb's already preempted a bit here. And then I'm going to compare that to the resurrection hypothesis or explanation as it's typically understood. So I just want to say in outset that as a way of preamble that I think that it's important to realize that most of what I say will not be persuasive if you already believe in the resurrection, as I suspect quite a few people listening to this will be, right? Because you're coming to the picture with a whole host of beliefs that I don't share. And that's actually what I conclude in my book, that if you believe a whole bunch of theological and other, with a certain set of presuppositions, that's going to lead you to a certain view about what the best explanation is. My key contention is actually that if you don't start with those set of beliefs, then the resurrection will not be the best explanation for the facts surrounding Jesus's, death and so forth. So that's sort of what I'm trying to contend here. I'm trying to provide an insight into an outsider's perspective, that is a non-Christian, specifically atheist in my case, perspective on the resurrection. And I hope that kind of comes across today. Just sort of trying to understand things from a different person's point of view and see why it is that it makes sense from their perspective. And then you can, only when you get to that stage, I think, can you actually make a proper analysis. Another thing that I'll say in advance is that I apologize that some of what I say will be a little bit repetitive, given that Caleb preempted my presentation of the RHBS model. I think it's a little odd to preempt as a rebuttal before someone actually has a chance to present their positive case, but I'll try to present it in a little bit more of a context and explain why I think things work the way that they do. Anyway, so that being said, let me first talk a little bit about what an explanation is so that we're all kind of on the same page here. What an explanation is a little bit contested philosophically, as is pretty much everything. But I take it to mean, and I think this is fairly standard, that it's some sort of story or picture or a model, if you want to use scientific terms, that makes sense of the facts, right? Charles Peirce used a good phrase, which I quite like. He says that given an explanation, the facts should follow as a matter of course. It doesn't mean that they follow with certainty, right? But they should follow with high probability. And explanations are things that account for strange features or things that are initially mysterious or unusual. It should render them explicable in terms of things that are antecedently understood or that are more consistent with our existing background information. So when we're assessing the quality of explanations, we look at different criteria, and there are three that I've identified here. Some people have slightly different lists. I think that these are broadly similar to those that Caleb presented, but I think it's important to talk a little bit about them so that we sort of understand how to apply them, or at least we're doing that consistently with an understanding of what we mean. So the first here is explanatory scope, and this refers to the range of facts that an explanation can account for. In general, the more the better. The more things that your explanation can give, can render plausible, then the better, other things being equal. Explanatory power, I understand to be how likely or how plausible the facts are rendered by the explanation. So remember, the idea is that an explanation is trying to give a reason or make explicable things that are otherwise strange or mysterious. The better it does at doing that, then the greater explanatory power it has. Again, other things being equal. And finally, plausibility refers to how plausible or likely are the propositions that are postulated by the explanation given our existing background knowledge. That is outside of the facts to be explained. If you appeal to the facts to be explained in order to defend the postulates that are required for the explanation, then it becomes a bit circular. So that's why I say outside the facts to be explained. And this relates to what I was saying at the start. It's very important that we don't, well, I mean, everyone does this to some extent, right? It's difficult, but it's very important to try to avoid incorporating in our background knowledge facts that you'd only accept if you already agreed with the explanation. And that's what I try to do with the RHBS model, to make it only appeal to facts that I think everyone should accept, regardless of sort of general worldview questions. Of course, how successful that is a further question. And plausibility is a matter of degree. It's not a binary thing. It's a matter of how plausible are those things that you need to postulate in order to account for the facts to be explained. So here's a diagrammatic representation, of how I understand the resurrection explanation to work. Caleb didn't quite explain. Well, we got a slide at the end which I think indicated the general idea of how the explanation works. So I think this is consistent with that. I guess we can discuss later if this is a misrepresentation. The idea here is that in the boxes, we see the facts that are to be explained, the key ones that I think are critical and that other scholars have indicated. So the empty tomb, belief in Jesus being resurrected, as well as the resurrection appearances. I think it's important to note at this point that when I say resurrection appearances, I mean that I think that there were individual and collective experiences of the risen Jesus. Now, I don't take that to mean that the accounts we have as preserved in the Gospels or in Acts are veridical in the details. And that's, again, an issue where we get to issues of background evidence. Because if the target is explain exactly the accounts as seen in the Gospels, I don't think the RHBS model really can do that. But I'm not trying to do that because I don't take those accounts as being veridical in the detail, only in the general idea that, there were appearances to groups. So that's maybe a point to tag for later where there may be some differences, but that's just what I mean by appearances here. So in order for the resurrection explanation to work, obviously you have to have God exist, and that's beyond the scope of this debate, so we'll just sort of take that for granted for the moment. Now that sort of enables or provides the possibility for God to raise Jesus from the dead, or desire to raise Jesus, or have a reason to raise Jesus, depending on how you want to frame that, which then explains that the tomb would be found empty, given the notion of a resurrection, which would partly explain the belief in the risen Jesus. But I don't think that itself explains the resurrection appearances, right? Because Jesus could be raised from the dead, but not appear to anyone. And this is what some, I think, Gnostics believed, or Mormons believed, that Jesus appeared to people in the prehistoric Americas, right? So it sort of depends on your beliefs, your theological beliefs about who would Jesus want to appear to, or what the reasons would be. So I think that you actually do need an additional postulate here, which is that Jesus had a reason or a desire to appear to his followers specifically, and not to other people that he potentially could. We'll talk about Paul later. I think that there's already enough to talk about here. But basically, Jesus just appeared to his followers, it seems, as resurrection appearances. And I think that that's an important aspect of the explanation as well, that needs to be postulated. He had a reason to do that, but not appear to other people he could potentially have done. And that then explains the resurrection appearances, which then, in combination with the empty tomb, explains the belief that Jesus had risen. Now, the RHBS explanation attempts to account for the same facts here. We see the empty tomb, belief that Jesus had risen, and the resurrection appearances. But obviously, the postulates here, which are in the circles, are different. So first, we have the removal of Jesus's body, which explains the empty tomb. Then in terms of, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And then in terms of the resurrection appearances, we have a number of components here. There's the individual hallucinations, which were prompted by, in part, the empty tomb, which then contributed by expectation and other phenomena to collective experiences of the risen Jesus, which then, in combination with the memory and cognitive biases, as well as socialization effects, led to the resurrection appearances, which then led to a belief that Jesus had risen. Now, in his in Caleb's remarks, he outlined a number of possibilities in terms of which sort of belief this would give rise to, and I think that so Caleb argued that only a physical appearances combined with the empty tomb would lead to the belief that Jesus had been resurrected. I think this is interesting here because I essentially agree with that, or at least I'm not convinced that that's the only way we could have got the beliefs that the disciples had. But I believe that that is the way that we got the beliefs that the disciples had. Basically, the disciples believed that there was physical appearances and they found the tomb empty. And so that led to their belief that Jesus had been resurrected. So I don't know that there's actually much disagreement between us on that point. The question is, how did the empty tomb come about, and how did the belief in physical appearances come about? And that's what I think the RHBS model is trying to account for. So let me now briefly try to motivate, at least in brief, some of these postulates here. So the first is the removal of Jesus's body. I might have to skip through this a little bit quickly. I don't want to respond too much to what Caleb said here. I'll save that for the rebuttal. I just want to motivate this as to why someone might think this, right? Again, Christians won't think this typically because they believe Jesus resurrected from the dead, but why might someone from a different perspective think this? Well, we have in the Gospels a record, and appealing to the Old Testament, that Jewish law required bodies to be taken down before evening. And that's widely agreed upon. Now, an additional aspect here is that the Gospels indicate the burial was rushed. It was on the day of preparation, which is the day before the Sabbath, and it seems that the commotion and everything that happened meant that it was fairly late in the day by the time Jesus died. Mark records that the tomb, that is Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, was nearby, and they laid Jesus there. Also, the fact that the women came on the Sunday morning to dress the body shows that the burial was not completed. So there's reasons to think that the burial was rushed, and therefore that a contributing factor to why Jesus was buried where he was because that was nearby to the site of crucifixion. Also, it's very plausible, indeed we have evidence from this from the Gospels, that the Romans were putting pressure on the Jews to keep things quiet. That was Pilate's key motivation, is that he just wanted to calm the situation down, and things did get a bit out of hand. And so they would have been motivated to keep things quiet and private, reduce the risk of further upheaval and uprisings. And this is why I think that Joseph of Arimathea, on his own initiative, or prevailed on possibly by the Romans, I don't know exactly, decided to temporarily store the body in his tomb, which was nearby. Now, reburial was allowed, or is allowed, at least according to the Encyclopedia Judica, in certain cases, such as when there was a risk of grave robbery, or there was other issues such as water damage. So this could have been used as a justification, and possibly a plausible one, given how famous Jesus was as a religious figure, as to why he could remove the body after the Sabbath ended on the Saturday evening. Also, Mary Magdalene doesn't seem to have think that it was too implausible that the body could have been removed. Just to clarify here, some people think that when I say Joseph of Arimathea moved the body, they have in mind him dragging bodies around. Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the council, and as far as we can tell, he would have been wealthy and influential. He's not going to have done this personally. He would have got servants to do this. And I think that he did it as soon as he possibly could because he wanted to have that body out of his family tomb. Indeed, I hypothesize that over the course of the Sabbath, when he was talking about this with his family and friends, they prevailed on him, that body needs to be removed as soon as you can. We don't want that in our family tomb. All right, so that's a bit of a motivation about the removal of the body. Now, I want to talk a little bit about individual and collective hallucinations. there's a lot of evidence that hallucinations are fairly common. I think that Caleb is broadly in agreement with this, so I might skip through this a bit quickly, as well as I'm running a bit short on time. Quite a large proportion of the population report in these general samples experiencing various types of hallucinations. Hallucinations are especially common in the case of bereavement, so following the loss of a loved one. There are interesting cases of complicated bereavement that are documented. For example, this 26-year-old man who believed his mother was still alive and sort of following him around, and he saw and talked to her after she died. So there's interesting cases like that. So I believe that initially what happened probably is that the one or more of the women disciples saw Jesus' tomb was empty, and that triggered a bereavement hallucination of the risen Jesus. Possibly it could have been triggered by misidentification as well. We have interesting non-recognition motifs in some of the Gospels, but that's speculative because we don't know. Now, that initial individual hallucination, then I think that when the women plausibly told the disciples about this, that combined with the empty tomb, combined with an expectation that there was some explanation as to why Jesus died, and trying to make sense of this, led to, over the course of days and weeks, collective experiences of the risen Jesus. And I've just shown a variety of examples here of other collective religious experiences, or parapsychological in this last case here, which I document in my book in more detail. So that's more just as a, why would I think that this is a plausible thing that could happen? It's because I've read into this, and I think that there are actually quite a lot of cases of this sort of thing happening in a variety of religious traditions. I don't have time to go into the details here, but essentially the psychological phenomena of collective experiences of paranormal or supernatural is very interesting. And in this book here, Donovan Rawcliffe actually talks a little bit about some of the mechanisms that can operate there. I don't have time to read the full quote there. Maybe you can read it while I'm talking about it. But the basic idea is that expectations play an important role there. And it's not that everyone experiences precisely the same thing, but rather that the initial experiences achieve what he calls a spurious similarity by process of harmonization and subsequent recall and conversation between each other. And that then leads to the final element of the RHBS model, which is the cognitive memory and social biases. These initial collective religious experiences, I don't think were like you read in the Gospels. I don't really know what they would have looked like. It's quite hard to say. That's lost to history. But I think that what we got initially was a series of sort of canonical accounts or stories which were preserved in creeds, which were then embellished on and added to by Gospel authors over the coming decades. Elizabeth Loftus has done a lot of work on false memories. False memories are very common and easy to induce in laboratory environments. There's interesting work on this in the case of flashbulb memories, which I don't have time to get through here. There's interesting work on the mechanisms about collective recall and contamination of memories between people when they talk to each other and experience their recollection. And a very important phenomenon that's also relevant here is cognitive dissonance, which is when people experience a disappointment or a conflict of something they believe deeply with that appears to be falsified. There's many examples of this, and I think we may come into talking about this later. And I think that this was very important for the disciples, shaping their beliefs as to how they came to believe in the resurrection. So overall, I believe that I presented some reasons for thinking that on a sort of shared background set of beliefs, that the RHBS model is a superior explanation to the resurrection hypothesis, which appeals, the latter of which appeals to beliefs such as God's desire to raise Jesus and Jesus' desire to appear to his followers that won't be widely accepted and I think require further motivation. So thanks for listening, and hopefully we can discuss this more.
All right. So that was very good opening speeches. And so now it's rebuttal time. Again, I want to say to the audience, I made this in a as a live chat comment myself. It's not, even though I'm clicking on it. Okay, here we go. That if you have questions, I know that sometimes in live streams people tend to talk amongst each other in the live chat, and that caused me confusion one time. So if you have a question for when that period comes up, and it's going to come up later, leave it in all caps, question with a colon, and then type whatever you want to ask our debaters. And that will differentiate your question to the debaters with whatever you may be saying to some other person. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, and lost the comment. Okay, so now we're entering the rebuttal period. Caleb, it's your turn. I got it pulled up here. 7 minutes for each of you. So Caleb, start now.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, James, for introducing that. I will say I do like how James explained his definitions of explanatory power, scope, and plausibility. That is something that, just due to time constraints, that I could have done a better job at instead of just simply stating. I could have explained what explanatory power and scope are. So I agree with his definitions as far as most of those go. I don't think we have much disagreement there. Same with plausibility. The first, I guess, objection I would have, well, not necessarily objection, I actually would agree with James that our background information and prior probability is definitely relevant to how we perceive these facts, or the historical data, if you will. And of course, this is contingent on whether or not one believes in God, what God's motivations are, etc. But I would probably fall into more of the natural theology camp given by people like Richard Swinburne and others, of thinking that there's good reasons that God would become incarnate and would want to atone for humanity's sins. Now, we don't have time to discuss all those details in 7 minutes, but I do think that atonement as different options compared to just simply forgiving everyone or simply punishing everyone is the best of both worlds and really helps build us up as people. And I think Jesus is a good candidate for that. In part for many reasons, not just because he was a self-declared prophet and faith healer, but also because Christianity seems to be the fulfillment of Yahweh's promise in the Old Testament that all nations would be able to hear, not the gospel in the way they say, but all nations would be able to be saved through Yahweh. And this is really something you only see with Christianity spreading. Judaism, in the other sense, has not been able to spread globally in any other way outside of Christianity in that sense. Now, when it comes to, we'll do the burial first. I think I agree with James that I think that Joseph used servants instead of himself. I don't think it's overly relevant to the case. But that's partially because Mark says where they laid him in the plural, and I think that's probably referring to servants, unless you want to take John's account that it was Joseph and Nicodemus. But it's not overly relevant to the account. And it is true that burials could be rushed sometimes. But I think that one of my bigger issues among many is that although the Sabbath may have been rushed, Jesus' execution was something that was known well in advance. It's not as if Jesus just had a stroke and died that day and they had to rush a burial. They knew the day before that he was going to be needed to be dead and buried prior to Passover. And so that would give plenty of time to dig a grave, especially if they already have a grave site for the condemned, as the Mishnah says that there is. I still don't think this necessarily explains as to the manner in which the tomb was found open. If the stone was rolled away and left open, I don't think that's a way that Joseph would want the tomb left open, especially considering Jewish cleanliness laws and the fact that this could be exposed to the elements. And if the stone wasn't rolled away, then the question is, well, how would the woman even know the tomb was empty to begin with? Did they break in? So that's a couple things. And again, if Joseph did bury the body according to the Mishnah in the criminal's graveyard, that same passage also says that a year later, when the flesh is decomposed, the family would come and rebury the bones, most likely in an ossuary, or depending on if you were poor class, an earth grave, and that would be the process. So even the criminal's tomb was a secondary burial place, and it's something where the Pharisees would know where the body is. They would have to give the body back to the family and be able to identify it and so forth. So I think even under that scenario, you would only have temporary confusion, and when the Pharisee would have to give the body to the family, that would be pretty easy to resolve. So I don't think that has as much of a plausibility as one may hope. As far as the gospel of the appearances, I know that James does not grant all of so I know James doesn't necessarily grant the eating and the touching and so forth. And I don't think we can prove these historically in the same way that we can prove general appearances. But that's kind of why I was trying to emphasize earlier the physicality you would kind of need to have. I don't think James necessarily denies that. He says, well, maybe they'd believe they were physical. And of course, he and other people like Dale Allison will give very vertical examples of people touching and hugging dead loved ones that are very real. And although I agree with all of this, I think the point is still that people who see dead relatives generally don't still believe that they either believe that they're still alive and that they never died in the first place, or they simply believe that they are dead and they're apparitions. But usually that happens after they vanish. Same with, and certainly apparitions of this kind would be known in ancient times as well. There's no reason to think this is only a modern thing. Of course, James's theory presupposes that. And so if there were veridical apparitions like this fairly commonplace, then it is interesting why this was different, where they concluded bodily resurrection, whereas other apparition cases that were also veridical, they didn't. And I think it's obvious that we can tell the difference between what we think is a veridical apparition and a physical person. You don't go about, walking around the street thinking that you're seeing apparitions. You think you're seeing physical persons, and there is a way to tell the difference. And that just depends on the context that is. So I think that we have to have some kind of criteria for determining what is a real person and what is merely an apparition. And that's something that most people can tell the difference between. Expectations and hallucinations. I actually do agree, James, as far as mass hysteria and groupthink. I don't like the argument that groups of people can't see things, because you do see that in plenty of cases that James has already discussed. And so I'm not going to deny that that they wouldn't have it because of the numbers. I do, however, question the kind of cognitive dissonance they would have. I actually will agree that they had cognitive dissonance, but I think it was for other reasons. I think their experience with the resurrection, Jesus caused them lots of cognitive dissonance because this was something they had no idea what was going on, and it made them reform their beliefs. But I think that the descriptions in the Gospels are the ones we would need to have the cognitive dissonance we see. I think that given James's model, the cognitive dissonance they would have is that, well, Jesus has been taken up to heaven by God and vindication, as the Son of Man, maybe in accordance to Daniel 7, and we have seen him in the clouds in glory. Now, someone may say, well, that's what they originally believed. But then, of course, the issue is, well, why don't we have traditions of the Gospel of Peter and the 12 seeing Jesus wearing white, shining like a star, as the gospel, as the resurrection passages in the Old Testament predict? Certainly, that would conform with their preconceived expectations. And there's really no apologetical motivation for making Jesus be unrecognizable and quite mundane, especially considering the angels of the tomb are much more elaborate in their appearance than even the resurrected Jesus is. We don't really even see this until Paul and John's vision and Revelation. So I think that's an interesting dichotomy that people like to write. Jacob Connell and Gerald Gold Collins have pointed out as well, as this is not the kind of description we would see. I think that's about where I'll start. The other points I brought up with the Recruitus argument weren't addressed, but again, that's the opening, so he has time to respond to that in his rebuttal. And I'm excited to see how the cross-examination goes. So I'll concede my time and let James do his rebuttal. Okay.
Yeah. So you did pretty good. You had like 30 seconds left when you stopped. I thought you were going to run out of time. So, James, it is your turn starting now.
Great. Thanks, Caleb. I think that it's good that we've got a fair bit of common ground, actually, which is useful for these discussions to actually get somewhere. So let me try to extend on what I said in my opening and flesh out a few details and respond to what some of Caleb has said. Again, before going further, I want to encourage people to think, to try to approach this debate from the perspective of thinking about how people from the other perspective think and understand about these things. Because often it's disagreement about certain specific points and background beliefs and assessment of plausibilities that leads to different viewpoints. And I think that there's too often a lot of times psychologizing the other and thinking that there must be just completely irrational. So that's what I'm encouraging people to do here, and particularly, obviously, with respect to my remarks. Think about why someone who's not a Christian might be skeptical given this sort of evidence. You don't have to agree, but at least you can come to a better understanding. So again, let me then take that up and start talking about some of the specifics here. So let's go through the aspects of the RHBS model and think about them and their plausibility with respect to the resurrection hypothesis. So regarding the empty tomb, I've heard this objection before that Jesus's Jesus's crucifixion and burial were known about beforehand, and so there would have been time to prepare a burial site. Like a lot of things, there's not really going to be enough detail to say exactly what happened. The Gospels themselves indicate that there was a sort of a rush, that Jesus didn't die until near the end of the preparation day, and that the proximity of the tomb was a reason he was buried there. Not that I necessarily trust all details in the Gospels, but it's interesting that coheres with what seems a plausible explanation. The fact that in the excitement and all of the disorder and upheaval that occurred at the time, there just hadn't been arrangements made, or whatever happened, those arrangements were disrupted. I just don't see that as especially implausible. If that's something that I just have to postulate in order for the explanation to work, I see that as something that's quite reasonable. One example that I like to give, which isn't directly relevant, but I just find amusing, is that NASA erased the original tapes of the Apollo moon landings, the Apollo 11 landings. You would think that, come on, NASA's going to be pretty organized, right? They're going to make sure that they have those, but like they just didn't keep a proper track on it. I don't know exactly why. Like I'm not saying that's direct proof, right? I'm just illustrating that in my experience of the world, there's lots of things that don't go as planned. And so I just don't think that that's a big deal. In terms of the issue that the body would be returned to the family, and so even if it had been removed, it would be handed over to them. So this is a question about what typically happened with executed criminals, especially crucified criminals. And my understanding is that it was common practice for them to be disposed of in a common grave. Now, I think that the family could request the body, and so possibly that happened in the case of Jesus. It's sort of unclear. I assume that the body was removed to a communal grave somewhere, and that no one was really concerned about informing the family. It's even possible that they were informed later, but didn't believe that that's what happened because they believed that Jesus had been risen. The body would have become unrecognizable after only a few days. So I think it's quite plausible that whatever happened, either there was a mix-up or that they didn't believe it, or no one was interested in telling the family because they didn't want trouble, they didn't want to bother, it's no one's job to do it. Again, I just don't see that as a really strong objection. Now, let's move on from the empty tomb and talk a bit more about appearances. I think it's refreshing that Caleb acknowledges at least the phenomena of collective religious experiences, because I find some defenders of the resurrection just sort of deny that these happen. Obviously, the fact that they happen doesn't prove that the resurrection appearances were one, but at least I think it's a good common ground to start from there. In terms of the idea that people don't usually come to believe that their loved ones are resurrected or have come back to life, even if they do see them or experience them, that this is an important aspect to understand here, because the whole point of the RHBS account is that it's a combination of factors that led to the outcomes. It's not just that the disciples or Jesus' women followers saw him. That alone, I don't think would have been sufficient to lead to a belief in resurrection. It's that they believed he was the Messiah and they wanted to figure out why he died, because that's not what they had been expecting. Plus, the tomb was found empty, which I assume they also didn't expect. Plus, then there were reports of him being seen, and then those were followed by collective experiences. Now, I don't know what the disciples originally thought after, let's say, a few days after that first happened. I suspect that they didn't have at that point an understanding of the resurrection. What needs to be explained is the creeds that we have evidence of in Paul's early writings, which do not contain a lot of details. They contain that Jesus was raised and that he appeared to them. Clearly, a resurrection belief had emerged by then, but then only later on in the Gospels do we get any sort of detailed accounts. So I think that all of the writings we see in the Gospels are written from a high-type perspective. Even if you think they're written by eyewitnesses, they were written from a high-type perspective of this is how they now understand what they experienced. And so I don't see it as problematic that they included details and phrased things in a way that was consistent with the understanding of resurrection. I think that basically the way that Caleb thinks they came to believe that Jesus was resurrected is the same way that I think. It's just that those initial appearances were triggered by different factors, not actually having Jesus appear to them. Those factors, empty tomb, crucifixion, Messiah belief, plus appearances, led to them having to try to make sense of this, and in prayer, reading the Old Testament, talking to each other, and over time, this was understood as being a resurrection. And then from that point, everything was seen in that light, and that's why we have things that seem to be consistent with that. There are, though, details in the gospel accounts which is, I think, inexplicable really under any point of view, or at least that they don't seem to, like the non-recognition motif, I think is fascinating. I don't really know why that's there. It may be the case that some of the initial appearances were actually triggered by non-recognition. Maybe the gardener was mistaken for Jesus and then that was combined. But that's speculative. I don't want to hang anything on that. If you think that Jesus did actually appear to people who knew him in life in a bodily form, I don't think that you would expect a non-recognition motif. So I think that there are aspects that are just not well explained there. Now, let's talk about the cognitive dissonance side of it. I think I've talked about that already. But just to emphasize that a little bit more, the fact that the disciples would have had cognitive dissonance itself doesn't tell you where they would have gone with that. So I can't tell you exactly what was in their minds back then, because no one knows that. That's not recorded. The earliest recordings we have are creeds that date from, even the most optimistic say that they're months afterwards. And I think there may be a couple of years afterwards, but honestly, it doesn't matter that much. The point is that there's still a lot of time for reflection and development within that time. And the creeds are fairly sparse as well. The details come in the Gospels, which are decades later. So we don't know that whole process. I don't think it's implausible, given what I know about religious innovation in other contexts, such as Muhammad seeing a single God in a polytheistic environment, such as Joseph Smith seeing Jesus and God separately when he was raised in an upbringing where that was unusual, and so many examples of new religious movements that emerge all over the world where people have different ideas. I don't think it's implausible that the disciples would have developed a slightly different understanding to account for what they'd experienced.
Okay, that is time. Okay, so now we are moving to the cross-examination period. Anybody get that? The cross-examination?
Yeah.
I'm a
Because
big
Jesus was on
fan.
the cross.
I'm a big fan of dad jokes. Nick Peters, if you're watching, Nick Peters thinks people need to stage an intervention because I'm telling way too many dad jokes lately. Before we get to that, Barely Protestant says, would you like to do a collab with me debunking a Dr. James White video he made with Molinism? Sure, let's do that. Let's get together sometime and we can discuss it over Messenger. So with that out of the way, we're going to get to the cross-examination period, which will be 20 minutes. I will set the timer. And after that, again, I want to remind you, everyone, if you have a question, leave it in the live chat for our commenters. For our debaters. and put it in all bold caps so that I will know that I'm not I'm not just getting a reply to someone else in the live chat, because that happened a couple of times. So the cross examination is starting now.
So, Evan, do we get 10 minutes each to ask questions, or is this just kind of like conversational? Just we're winging it as far as structure goes.
Yeah, I think we can have a conversation.
Okay. Well, James, would you like to start a question, or would you like me to start a question?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I have a lot written down here, so I'm trying to do it. I guess we can like rapid fire. So I guess my one just question for clarification: if you do believe that Jesus was crucified alongside other criminals, do you also think that they were buried with in Joseph's tomb, and that all of them were being rushed at the same time, or do you think that was a different scenario?
Well, that's interesting. I guess it's possible that they all were. Again, I don't know if Jesus was buried with other criminals as well. He may well have been. If he was, maybe they were buried in the same tomb. But I think that the concern with Jesus is that he had such a high profile. So I don't think those same concerns would have applied to if they were common criminals. I don't think anyone was much concerned about them. But we know that there was a lot of upheaval in Jerusalem surrounding Jesus's trial and then crucifixion, as you would expect. I mean, there's other stories of Messiah claimants and that sort of thing happening. So I think that was the main motivation, that they didn't want to have to move the body at maybe some greater distance in a public place. So yeah, I think probably not if Jesus was crucified with other criminals.
Okay, gotcha. And so you also brought up that generally crucifixion victims were given mass graves. Is that what you think that Joseph was reburying Jesus in, or do you think that, because what I was referring to, I just for clarification, what I was referring to the opening was in the Mishnah Sanhedrin 6:5 and 6:6, it says that when the Sanhedrin sentenced people to death, they had 2 graveyards set for those who'd be executed, and then they wouldn't have any mourning for them. The family, they couldn't be laid in a family tomb; they had to be buried there. And then after a year, when the body had decomposed, the bones would be collected and given to the family. And that's typically what I was referring to. And then that's I think people like Byron McCain and others have shown that's there's elements of that in the gospel accounts, because there's no mourning for Jesus. He's not given to the women or the family members. He's buried by a member of the Sanhedrin and so forth. So do you think Joseph would have reburied him in this courtyard for Jewish criminals? Is that what you had in mind? Or do you think this is a purely...
I don't know. Yeah, I don't think we have enough evidence to say. That things typically happen is not necessarily mean that they always happen that way, especially when there are unusual circumstances, as in the case of Jesus. I think that largely it's a matter of speculation. Again, I think that the possibility of indifference or miscommunication is large in these sorts of cases, especially because here we're talking about Jesus was actually crucified by the Romans on behalf of the Jews. So I'm not quite sure even if Joseph would have sort of felt that, well, now I'm giving the body back to the Romans and you can bury it, because we don't actually care about giving the bones back to his family. Maybe, as I said, the family didn't even ask for it because they thought he was resurrected anyway. So to me, this is quite speculative, and I just don't know what happened. I think that it's most likely that Joseph just wanted the body out of his tomb. He was prevailed upon to put it there for the reasons that I mentioned, and wanted it out, and probably didn't care much about what happened to it afterwards.
Okay, yeah. So that's I'm trying to think of what I was going to say with the Roman thing. Yeah, because it is true that it's complicated, because Jews could not execute people under Roman rule. That was Roman authority. But they did still consider Jesus's death something that was against. They were against the Jewish law, right? I think the other 2 criminals were probably zealots or rebels of some kind. I don't think it explicitly states it, but I think there would have been a difference. And I think that had, besides the scenario that he was left on the cross and not buried, which I think we both agree is very unlikely given Passover and Jewish sentiments to burial. Generally, what we see is that during Roman burial, if a crucifixion victim was buried, they'd be given to the family, and the family could do that. And this is in Philo and Josephus and places in like the Simchat and others. And for someone who's executed by a Jewish tribunal, at least sentenced to death by a Jewish tribunal, then they would be buried by a member of the Sanhedrin in a Jewish court. And I think Joseph's case seems much more similar to that. It's also not just because Joseph buried him, because again, there's no mourning, and there's certain traditional elements that are more parallel to that. So I think, and you're right, it is speculative, but I think that because we have other sources that seem to at least not contradict this, and at least seem to have some similarities, it's a plausible thing to say. So that's why I personally don't necessarily that. Now, as to the point of that maybe the family simply denied it. I think that's an interesting point, but I have issues with that because when we look at later polemics between Jews and Christians, where Jews were saying, oh, you stole the body. Now you could say, well, at that point, nobody knew where the body was. That might be true, but the issue is we have to ask, how did the polemic evolve into that? Because it seems like the earliest polemic would be the Jews were saying, Christians were just saying, well, the body is there, but that's not his. Actually, in some of the examples you gave with people like, oh no, not Sabbatai Sevi, who is the modern Jewish rabbi and like who died in the 90s. Schneerson, that's what I'm thinking of.
That's right.
Yeah, Schneerson. When you have people in that kind of cognitive dissonance, you have them saying, well, people say that Rabbi Schneerson's body is here, but we know that he lives on with us. But in these scenarios, they're not denying that the body is there. They're simply saying, well, he is there, but that's not him. So I would expect Christians in this scenario to say, okay, well, the Jews are saying this is Jesus, but Satan has tricked them, or the Jews swapped the body with someone else and do this. And then you'd see this polemic back and forth. But the only polemic we have is a polemic of a stolen body. So it doesn't seem like anyone was trying to counteract a misidentified body, a stolen body. So that's just another thing I didn't know if you have any comments on that, but.
Yeah, I don't find those sorts of arguments about what we would expect to see polemic-wise very persuasive, because we don't have any polemic from the 1st century. I'm not sure exactly what the polemic you're referring to dates from, but we don't have any writings that are hostile to or like trying to argue against Christianity from the 1st century. So I think that we have no idea what the discourse was from that time. People could have been saying all sorts of things and it wouldn't be preserved, or hasn't been preserved.
Do you think that in Matthew 28 with the guard narrative that Matthew is trying to respond to a Jewish polemic that the body was stolen?
Well, I think that I think that that's an apologetic insertion that he's trying to respond to something. But again, so I suppose you could say that that's an inference about a polemic that existed at the time. But even that's decades later, right?
Sure.
Nothing that happens more than, I don't know, a few months at most is really relevant with respect to the location of the body, because by then anything could have happened to it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It also depends whether or not, by the way, you think that the site was preserved, because if you I would be inclined to think that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has very good archaeological evidence to think that it was being venerated pretty early on, since at least the 40s. And so even if these traditions are later, if that spot was still preserved and people still knew where to find it, then it would be a bit more difficult to say that.
Well, that's the site of Jesus's tomb, right? But Christians weren't looking for Jesus's body. They didn't believe that there was a body. So why would they go looking for it? I just don't understand. It may well be that site was preserved. I'm not persuaded by that, but maybe it was. But that's not where Jesus's body would have been, right? The whole point is that his body wasn't there.
Oh, sure. But I'm saying, if Christians were preserving the site, saying this is where Jesus's body used to be, and the body, and let's say that there was a body there and they simply denied it, and this was like during the time Matthew, this was decades later, do you think Christians would still say, obviously there's a body in there, you don't know what you're talking about? Christians say, well, that's not really him, he only appears to be dead, or something like that. Do you think that's a more likely?
Well, I don't think they were saying that, right? Because I'm not saying that Jesus' body was actually there. I think it was somewhere else and they didn't know where it was, and maybe people said, actually, this is Jesus' body, but they just didn't believe them. But the point is, I think it's actually I don't think it did happen, but I think it's well within the realm of sort of psychological plausibility that they could have said exactly that, right? Because we see people saying things like that. So I don't think that sort of response would be that implausible. I just don't think, given the particular circumstance, that is what happened. But I absolutely think sometimes you haven't argued this, but some people say, look, if the Sanhedrin or the Romans knew where Jesus' body was, they would have, they would have dragged it through the streets. And I don't find that persuasive, because, first of all, I don't think they would have been interested to do it early enough for it to make any difference. But even if they had, I don't think that it would have persuaded pretty much any Christians. I think that there's plenty of evidence that many people aren't persuaded by that sort of thing in those sort of contexts.
And the idea of Jewish leaders having a decaying corpse throughout the streets of Jerusalem seems like, as far as the purity laws, they would not like that.
That's also an issue, yes. Although, yeah, exactly. But anyway, so I know you haven't argued that, but I'm just emphasizing that I come to this from the point of view that there's a lot of evidence that people can sort of rationalize in a lot of ways that are quite bizarre, or we would regard as bizarre. And so I would expect that to be, that's the background I come to when looking at this. And so I don't necessarily expect I don't expect the early Christians to be sort of being hyper skeptical and approaching everything in the way that a modern skeptic would. And so if our story relies on them sort of reacting that way, then, well, that's not how I think about it. And again, I'm not saying that you've argued that, but I do. Right. I would say that I sort of maybe find that in some other apologetic responses, and that's why I see it differently, because I don't think that they were like that.
Yeah, I have one more question that's kind of entailed with a couple of things, and then I'll let James ask some. I said I won't take up all the time. So I think I'm trying to remember what you said the combination was. So you said that you think a combination of an empty tomb, somewhat veridical appearances that they saw, as long as cognitive dissonance script appeals to the Old Testament, eschatological expectation, and messianic expectation. This was all the factors needed to generate resurrection belief. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think you mentioned everything.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to leave anything out. And what I would argue is that I think even given all those combinations, it still doesn't seem clear as to why they believed in resurrection over assumption, because you could have all of those factors and heavenly assumption would still seem to fit all of those bills. I mean, I'm reminded of stories like the Testament of Job, where house falls on Job's children. They're trying to dig it out and they can't find the body. And they look up in heaven and see Job's children, enthroned in glory. And I feel like if, the disciples under a similar circumstance, thinking the world was going to end, seeing the body of Jesus missing, seeing him in a glorious vision, this would be very similar to something like the Transfiguration, where Moses and Elijah appear. And of course, they believed Elijah and Moses had missing bodies that were taken up to heaven. And these people were supposed to return at the end of time during the resurrection, which is very similar to what, the Perusia beliefs were. So it seems to me you can get all of that, and it still doesn't explain why they made a distinction between assumption and resurrection, when you could have assumption without a resurrection. So I didn't know if that's...
Well, you could, right? So I'm not sure if so this almost plays into sort of counterfactual theology, like what alternative theologies could have been developed. I think that it could have gone that way, and it didn't. A couple of points that I want to make. One is that we don't know what they originally thought. I actually think it's likely that these things were debated early on until the understanding was developed in terms of understanding this as a resurrection. I'm not sure that assumption would explain why Jesus died. Now, I suppose you could come up with a reason, right? But then what they did was come up with a creative reason as it is, right? Because as you point out in your book, and other scholars have, resurrection was not understood to have anything to do with the Messiah, or that the Messiah would die for our sins. This is all theological innovation. They're taking existing ideas and changing them, mutating them, I think is a word that Wright likes to use. So I guess the question is, well, why did they mutate it that way and not the other way? Well, I mean, I don't know. To me, that I don't know that the resurrection explanation provides any better insight into this, right? Because I mean, the claim is, again, that, well, they believed that Jesus was resurrected because they thought that they saw him and the tomb was empty. And, well, that's the same things that I think. I don't quite know why this is an argument against my position. I guess another way to look at this would be, well, could God have just assumed Jesus up into heaven? Would that not have just as well served the purposes? This is pushing it one layer back, right? Like, assuming the theology is correct, you could say, well, why did God do it this particular way? Why not assume Jesus into heaven and then he comes down and appears to people? That seems like, why does it have to be a resurrection per se? So I feel like I could make the argument at a meta level against, like, well, why did God do it one way? Because I don't know that the Christian necessarily needs that sort of explanation. So I don't necessarily think that I need to have an explanation. But why did the theology go this way and not another way that it maybe could have gone? I mean, I don't know, but it's just, I think that either was a plausible option and they went down. It's just that's what happened.
Yeah, but I asked that because earlier you were talking about explanations and explanatory power and explanatory scope, and I feel like you're conceding that your model doesn't really explain why they believed one over the other. Whereas if you were to ask me why I think the resurrection model is, I would say because the brute physicality that would be needed, which we see in the Gospels, and again, one can deny that, but I would like to say that makes the best sense of what we see. That is different than simply a heavenly vision. When they see Moses and Elijah in the Transfiguration for a moment and they disappear, they don't necessarily change their beliefs, but Jesus appears to them multiple times, eating with them, touching them in a way that's not really analogous to anything, even to most apparitions, when you have all of those elements in there. And I know you don't.
Well, again, I think
you concede all of those, but
one thing you point out in your book, Caleb, is it's not only why did they come to believe in a resurrection, but why didn't they just think that he was like physically raised to life temporarily, like Lazarus?
Well, that depends if you the nature of the appearances. If you think that these were visions, and that it's obvious why they didn't think that. And of course, in the Gospels, you don't just have physical touching, but you have vanishing and walking through walls and all this other stuff. So I'm just saying that I feel like under taking the Gospels that we have, and one can dismiss them, but my argument is that because I think we need these elements in there to explain it, it makes sense as to why they're in there, and that's a historical memory. Same with, by the way, the ideas that Jesus's appearance is very contrary to what the scriptures describe the resurrection looking like, which is also a strange apologetic move. And going, this will be like my last point, then I'll let you talk because I know I've been talking for a while. I agree with you that religious innovation can happen, like with Muhammad and Joseph Smith. I'm not denying that it does. I'm just saying that I think the resurrection in this case, the bodily appearances, explains why that innovation happened, whereas taking these more mundane details, the prior probability they would believe an assumption is much greater because that was already a belief that existed that would fit all of that. And they really wouldn't need to have that kind of cognitive dissonance, or at least it wouldn't need to take that form because assumption would be a perfectly plausible model that people already believed, and you wouldn't have to come up with something new. As far as like Muhammad and Joseph Smith, well, Muhammad, although he did live in a polytheistic culture, certainly he was familiar with Judaism and Christianity. He references them all the time. He interacted with the Christians. He certainly knew the Gnostic Christians because the Quran has many references to Gnostic stories. And same with Joseph Smith's beliefs about the Hebrews being descendants of Israelites. That can actually probably be traced to I forget what the book is called, The Way of the Hebrews, or something, a book that was published a few years before the Book of Mormon was. So I think in many regards you can see plagiarisms from elements of that. So I would say that you have to look on a case-by-case basis, and in those cases, I think it's easier to explain Joseph Smith's or Muhammad's cognitive dissonance than it is to explain the early Christians. But I'll leave it at that, and you can ask something if you'd like.
Yeah, well, I think that this comes at the. I'll make some comments there, and then I have one or two questions. I think that comes to the heart of the matter about explaining why we got what we got, so to speak, in terms of the basic facts. Again, I read the Gospels through the lens of thinking that these are accounts written for theological, well, they are written for theological purposes, decades after the fact. So whoever wrote them is seeing things through a particular lens, right? So many of the details there, I think, are there precisely to serve that purpose. Not that they thought that it was false. I mean, we could talk about that style and so on, but that's why we see a lot of those details. All I think that you need to get to being exactly where you are is some reason why some of the initial appearances were more sort of bodily as opposed to more heavenly. And I think that there are plausible reasons why that might have been the case. For example, a bereavement hallucination, many of those are often reported as being sort of quite ordinary, that you just sort of have, you just sort of see them or something, or a non-recognition motif. There's an option there. I don't know. There's not enough detail there. But the point I'm making is to say that all you need is some initial reason why there was a more, let's say, earthly as opposed to a heavenly nature of the appearances, and then that leads to an expectation, and then that's why the appearances are seen in that light, and that explains why they interpret it one way as opposed to the assumption way. So I think that you can make sense of that. Now, in terms of comparing this to other religious cases, yeah, absolutely, there are antecedents in the Muhammad and Joseph Smith. Of course, you can point to differences as well. So in neither case did Judaism or Christianity have room for a further revelation, either to Muhammad or to Joseph Smith. And so there's many aspects of the theology that they had to morph and change or mutate, if you wanted to put the word. So I think that you can make a parallel case for many of these religious movements about mutations from existing beliefs. And you could argue, well, why did they go this way? Why didn't they go another way? Isn't there an easier way that they could have reconciled it? From my point of view, what we see in the case of the early Jesus tradition is fits within the underlying framework of religious innovation that we see across the world in different contexts. Obviously, it's unique in the sense that everything's unique, right? It's every case is individual, but at the same time, I don't see it as requiring some supernormal explanation, while the others can be explained by a set of psychological and sociological explanations. And again, this is part of the overarching disagreement, right? Is that I see what happened to Christianity as remarkable, of course, but remarkable in the context of the sort of things that we can explain occurring in many times and places in the world of different religious innovations and seeing miraculous things or perceived miraculous things and so forth. So that's where I'm coming from it. And from that perspective, I don't see anything there that requires us to import or apply any sort of supernatural explanation there. So I think that is maybe a good endpoint to that line. Now, a question that I wanted to ask, I guess this is actually similar to what we were just talking about, and something that I haven't addressed yet is some of you call it the recrudescence argument. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that word. About sort of modern miracles and appearances and healings that are attributed to Jesus. Now, I found this argument very, very interesting. So I guess the question is, what do you see as the relevance of these to establishing the resurrection? Because just to clarify why I'm asking this, I don't believe that any of these are veridical, but the thing is, I could grant that these are veridical and still not believe in the resurrection. I don't actually see how they establish the resurrection in any way. Suppose Jesus was assumed into heaven. or suppose that Jesus actually did rot, body did rot into the ground, but he just sort of, because he's supernatural, overcame death anyway. You know, like there's so many other ways that God could have done it, all things that could have happened theologically speaking, that you could, and then you could still have these miracles taking place in the name of Jesus. I just don't know how they in any way provide evidence for the resurrection. So I guess that's my question. What do you see as the evidential connection between these and the resurrection?
That's a good question. So that's actually the primary thesis of the next book I'm working on, is kind of an expansion of that Recruitus argument. As far as, well, I guess to take it to different ways, if it was to a naturalist, I would argue that given a naturalistic hypothesis, all these are not at all predicted, and this is better explained under a supernatural hypothesis. Now, if you're going to say why resurrection bodily instead of Jesus just being a ghost or being assumed, that is a better question, and I would say that it's relevant because these, and when they were seen in their context, typically reinforce Christianity or lead people to convert to Christianity. And of course, Christianity, Orthodox Christianity at least, is remitted to the idea that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. Now, if this was happening in like only Gnostic context, for example, where they teach Jesus did not bodily raise, that he was a spirit and just pretended to be incarnate and so forth, then you could say, well, he's doing this to vindicate Gnostic theology, right? So it's the context in which these occur that I think is meant to show vindication of the theology, the fact that it's meant to convert people and so forth. So that's kind of the context behind it. It would be rather strange for Jesus to be converting people to a religion that has fundamentally false beliefs about, the nature of his resurrected body and salvation and so forth. So that's kind of the very broad argument I can get into without getting into complicated theology that I don't want to bog us down on.
Yeah, well, I suppose that we could probably spend a lot of time talking about that. Maybe I'll just say, from my point of view, again, thinking about what an explanation is supposed to do, if we take that these claims of healings and appearances and dreams and so forth as the data, like the claims of these, and we want to say that Jesus rose from the dead explains those, I don't see the connection. Like, it doesn't explain them, right? I don't see how you would expect to see modern day healings from the fact that Jesus was resurrected, because there could be those healings and he didn't resurrect just as easily, or he could resurrect and not do those healings, as some Christians think. Some Christians don't believe in that this stuff still happens, right? I'm just not seeing that there's any explanatory power there, versus what I would, of course, the way I would explain these, is, I'm sure you would be aware, is just to appeal to the same mechanisms that I would use to explain what happened, the individual hallucinations and collective experiences and socialization and memory and all of that stuff. I would appeal to the same stuff, right? So I don't know. I just feel, obviously the details are going to be different in each case.
Right.
I just don't see that the resurrection explains any of these things. I suppose you could say, well, I mean, they fit with the resurrection, but that's not the same as actually explaining them.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's I try to say it in the way that I don't know how much you're granting as far as historical Jesus scholarship, but most scholars do think Jesus was some kind of faith healer during his ministry. And
yeah,
so
sure,
forth.
sure.
And so it makes sense that the behavior Jesus had during his lifetime would, if we see similar occurrences of that happening in a Christian context, that makes more sense with Jesus still being active. Whereas if Jesus is dead, and dead people can't really do much, then it would be harder to explain how someone could do this on the name of a dead man.
Well, but Jesus is God, right? Or even a powerful angel or something else. He could do presumably many of these. Like, Jesus isn't healing people in the way that he did, which is just walking around where everyone could see and touching people. Like, that's not happening, right? At least I presume that's not. I mean, there are people who claim to be doing that. I think there was an interesting interview with Jesus in Australia.
I know what you're talking about.
Mythical. Yeah. So there are people who claim to do that, right? But they're not typically taken very serious. Interesting case studies as well, I think, for how these sorts of things develop. Yeah. But I guess the point is that I don't know. Maybe there's no need to belabor this point, but the fact that there are these miracle claims today just doesn't seem to have anything to do with whether Jesus was bodily raised to me, and I'm not sure that it's predicted in terms of sort of theologically why there's a particular connection between one and the other.
Okay, I'll let Caleb respond to that, and then we'll get to the live chat Q&A.
Sure. Yeah, well, I also bring that up because I know that in your in the past you've mentioned comments like, well, if other people, why did Jesus only appear to the disciples, and why did he appear to Paul and all this stuff? So I guess my question is, are you saying we just can't predict who Jesus would appear to at all, or that we would expect Jesus? Because I mean, people like Richard Carey say, yes, we should expect Jesus to appear to the Sanhedrin or Pilate or whatever. Or are you just saying we'd have no idea who he would appear to? I guess I'm just asking.
That's what I think, right? And I think that that's evidence against the Christian claim. But my point is that those would be resurrection appearances that would fit into that category of resurrection appearances. And I presume that you wouldn't say that current miracles fit into the category of resurrection appearances. In fact, in your book, you make a distinction about what the Christians made the distinction between at Pentecost, that there's that sort of dividing line between it. So
right,
yeah. I would expect the resurrection appearances to fit in that category. And there's other differences as well about the difference between healings and resurrection appearances, but we can.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say on that, that's a good point. And that's where it gets complicated with people like Paul, because Paul considered his appearance to be a resurrection appearance, and yet his is more more visionary, but it also, leads to blindness. Other people can sort of hear and see it. So I would kind of put modern visions of Jesus in that category where it's more visionary in the sense I don't think you could take a picture and see everything. It's as physical as it would be the Gospels, but I do think it is extramental and has real world effects like hearing diseases and stuff like that. So that's where I would kind of in that point there. But yeah, Evan, do you want to do questions?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's we're gonna go into the live chat Q&A. I lost my place because something happened. My Google Chrome just went to a totally different site, and I got kicked out of the stream for a moment there. So let me see when the questions started coming, and then I'll start asking them. Here's one. Jerome Daniels asks, question: if the other religions are false, is there a psychological explanation for why those from other religions have religious experiences of their own God? Can't this apply to Christians?
Is this a question for both of us, or?
I think it's a question for you, Caleb.
Okay. So I'm trying to understand the way he's wording this here. He's saying if people only see their own God, is this something that we would say about the disciples, that they saw Jesus because that was expectation? That's how?
Well, if I can jump in there, maybe just because this is basically what I said before. If there's a psychological or sociological explanation for appearances or miracles in other religious claims that you don't think are veridical, could those same mechanisms not be also operational to explain Christian appearances?
Okay, so you're saying
because that's kind of what I argue. I don't know if that's exactly what the question I had in mind, but maybe that's
so you're saying if we saw similar supernatural or stuff happening in other religions, would that confirm? I don't know if I'm butchering that.
Well, so you got to explain the reports in other religions, right? Well, presumably. Yes. And then the question would be, well, how do you explain them? And then could that explanation not also apply to Christian claims?
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe especially today. I'm not sure if.
Yeah, definitely. Because you give a lot of examples like Hindu and other examples and Marian apparitions and stuff in your book as well, which is really good. Yeah, that's a good question. So originally the answer would be yes, but it depends. I think I'm a big fan of looking at things on a case-by-case basis. So I try not to be general and just have sweeping assertions of all. In fact, actually, I have a chapter in the upcoming book I'm doing on miracles and other religions, and it's kind of a complicated argument. The main argument I give against that is I'm not saying that these are necessarily false, but I think Christian miracles are different in that they lead to at least significant conversion. I'm not saying that conversions don't happen on the other end, but as far as statistically significant conversions, where you'll have entire tribes and thousands of people converting, as you see in Acts, because of Christian miracles, whereas miracles in other religions are typically only attested by people who already believe their religion. You don't see that many people leaving their religion because they saw something in Hinduism, for example. I'm not saying that never happens, but that's kind of how I would approach it, but it really just depends on the case. And so theoretically, could it apply to Christians? Yes, but it would depend on what data you're looking at. So, yeah.
Okay, so Camille Gregor says, why do people think puns and dad jokes are synonymous? That's the real question we should be asking, and I guess that's directed towards me. I'd say the way I would answer it is all puns are dad jokes, but not all dad jokes are puns. Okay, so now on to something more serious. Jay Victor asks, question: if we have two hypotheses, let's say resurrection and RHBS model, that might equally explain the data, which one do you, Caleb or James, will choose and why? That's kind of awkwardly worded.
Which of the
Isn't that what we've just been arguing?
Yeah.
Which model do we prefer? Isn't that what
that kind of seems like that kind of seems like what the whole debate is about.
Well, let me caveat by this. I will say that I do think natural explanations are generally more plausible and probable than supernatural ones, but I do think that you have to look at it depending on each case, and certain evidence can be more plausible in a supernatural context than a natural one. But again, I don't want to overgeneralize and say that applies for everyone. So I think there needs to be criteria for miracle cases. I don't think we should accept all of them, and I don't think we should dismiss all of them. It really depends. So there are some claims. I think some objective criteria that people like Tim McGrew give will be like, how long after the event was this recorded, or do we have people talking about it? How far away was it? Was there critical investigation? Was this only by people who actually believed it? Was there persecution? Was this did this disconfirm previously held beliefs, and so forth? Do people have motivation for lying? Do they gain money or power? So all of that's relevant to look at the data. And in some cases, when you do that, will fall apart. In some cases, will still hold. So it just depends on who you're looking. Oh, another I forgot was like the number of witnesses do you have? Was this like one guy seeing something, or was this a public miracle? And I know James gives examples of public ones too. Which, by the way, just to caveat that, I also think it's interesting that he gives examples of Marian apparitions, because I know my Catholic friends would not necessarily say that those are hallucinatory. I mean, I'm a Protestant, I'm not a Catholic. And so although I do think for other reasons that Marian apparitions are likely, at least most of the time, not veridical because they're inconsistent, I do think that examples he gives like Zaytun are actually very interesting. And we know that's not hallucination because we have pictures of it. You could say it's pareidolia, but I don't think, I have yet to see a good explanation as to where the light came from and how to explain the nature that we have in all of the reports we have. So there are cases where I'm not entirely willing to say that it is just mass hysteria. And I think those are interesting evidences of stuff that may potentially be supernatural. So I'll just throw that out there.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of, can you remove the question just so I not covered up? Thanks.
Yeah.
I just want to make a couple of comments about this. One is that I'm a naturalist. So I don't think there's any supernatural paranormal events. I think in principle, there could be evidence, like could be sufficient evidence of such things, but I think it's quite difficult. One of the big problems is that typically the criteria for establishing them, indeed, this is even the Catholic Church uses this basically for establishing sainthood, because there have to be a certain number of miracles, is basically by exclusion. You try to exclude all known naturalistic explanations, and I think that that's a very flawed approach. There are approaches in medicine which have diagnosis by exclusion. You just rule out everything else, and well, you're sort of a residual category, but that's known to be problematic for sort of the reasons that it just relies on assuming that you've been able to properly identify and rule out all the other phenomenon. So that's not an in principle argument that there can't be supernatural phenomena. It's an argument for methodological caution about how we actually establish these sorts of things. Because I just don't believe in diagnosing supernatural events by excluding known natural causes. Because if we did that, I don't think science would actually be able to progress, right? Because science only progresses by engaging with things that we don't understand. And if we just always said, well, we can't explain it in any other way, therefore it's going to be supernatural, and stopped looking for a natural explanation because we found the supernatural one, I think that science would have a lot of trouble. Not saying that Caleb's arguing that, of course. I'm just presenting my perspective on some problems, I think, with inferring supernatural causes. One other thing that I wanted to say is that people, in my experience of interacting with people about these sorts of things, people are typically very protective of events or cases that they think are significant or important from their perspective, and quite dismissive of claims from other religious perspectives. I've known this, for example, from Mormons who will argue vociferously about the quality of the evidence for Joseph Smith and his, which I think is quite interesting, actually. But then other Christians are largely dismissive of this, or likewise Muslims, or likewise Christian conscious people that I know, likewise people who are more into the sort of paranormal sort of side of things, or homeopathy advocates. And again, that doesn't disprove any of them, right? But I think that it should cause us to be cautious, right? Because the idea that we need to evaluate each case by case is actually itself problematic, because we're never going to have the time to investigate every single miracle or supernatural claim in much detail. I've devoted more time than most people, and there's still like millions of claims that I could never possibly investigate. And the thing is, the people who believe the claims always have the most time and resources and interest in defending them. So they're almost always going to be more well-versed than you. So, you know, if you talk to a Mormon or a Muslim or a Christian or whoever about their particular claims, they're going to have more facts and more basis than you do. So again, I don't have a specific answer to that. I do worry about these things in terms of like peer disagreement and biases and things like that. But I just think that we should think about that and think in terms of, well, maybe this is most persuasive to me because I spend my time trying to defend this claim, and it applies to me as well. This is not just to Caleb, right? Like we spend our time looking at the things that agree with us and just kind of ignore or don't spend much time or being over skeptical about things that we don't agree with. Whereas people in that case, you know, they do it that way. So I worry about this sort of thing with respect to miracle claims, especially with the whole, it is a case by case thing. because there are just more cases that we can ever investigate. So I think that there's a call for a bit of modesty there. That's just my sort of general perspective.
Right, and that's just what I was trying to say. I think having criteria there as like a kind of a filter to get rid of, to at least rule out all the ones that don't fit the criteria, and then the ones that fit the criteria are the ones that we spend more time investigating. That's
true. Although the criteria, I agree with that. The criteria you use, though, will depend on your point of view. So Muslims are very impressed with the textual quality of the Quran, and they use that as a criteria. And the corruption of the Bible causes real issues for them. Whereas Christians are just less concerned about that, and they focus more on the number of witnesses, which is less of an issue for Muslims. So I agree that criteria are helpful, but even there, I think often the criteria come after the belief that you want to defend, right? And so that's the case with naturalists as well. I'm not excluding them from that, right? If you set up the criteria such that nothing can ever get to that threshold, then you won't find anything above the threshold. So, I think that there's still issues there.
Sure, yeah.
Spartan Theology says, I'm busy, so I can't listen right now, but I want to stop by and say, hey, Spartan Theology. Camille Gregor asks, question for Caleb, what's the second best explanation of the evidence?
Camille loves asking this question.
That's a good question. Yeah, I know. Camille's on Facebook all the time commenting on stuff, and it's really funny. That's a good question. So is he just saying second in general, like natural explanation? I would say that I guess I would say that if I wasn't a Christian, I would probably take more of a Gnostic approach of what James was saying of Jesus was assumed or was a ghost and go by there. I think Dale Allison kind of does the same thing with saying, well, these are visions, but they're divinely caused visions and not hallucinations in the regular sense. As far as natural explanations goes, but I think was also, again, I'm not saying that we can rule them out completely. I think it's a probability thing. So I don't necessarily say that it's impossible that cognitive dissonance could have happened in this way and so forth, or that it's impossible the body could have been moved. So I would actually probably take something fairly similar to James's model, actually, which is why I think it's better than what people like Ludemon and some others will say. I think that comparing these to modern apparitions where family members sometimes multiple people can see them at the same time and touch and eat with them and come away with different things like that, I think that would be the most interesting parallel. And in fact, in the book I'm working on, I actually have a whole chapter. I have a chapter where I give the devil's advocate, and I have a chapter where I give the divine advocate and compare them. And I do my best to steel man the devil's advocate. I'm going to have, skeptics read it and stuff like that. And that's kind of what I go to. I would say that, well, Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. He clearly thought the end was coming and didn't. And so that should lower our confidence. Of course, we didn't even bring that up in this debate, but, or you could say Jesus believed in people who probably didn't exist, like Moses, which most scholars don't think existed. And he thought Daniel was written by Daniel, and that's a forgery. And this should lower our confidence that Jesus was God. And so therefore these appearances were probably not supernatural. We shouldn't think God has anything to do with them, and that these were probably some kind of hallucinations or apparitions, which we know can appear veridical. So that's probably what I would say if I was taking the opposition.
I feel like I should answer that question as well. I'm not sure why it was only directed to you. So it's a second best explanation. That's hard. I think that probably if I was to go with something that's significantly, one of the problems with naturalistic explanations is that they're all over the shop about exactly what they accept and what they try to explain. I think that the idea that there was an empty tomb is something that is, I think that it's more likely than not, but I think it's also possible that that's legendary, and that then requires a reconstruction of the sort of scheme of events. So that's an option that I would consider as well. In terms of whether there was anything sort of supernatural happening, part of the issue is with the criteria there in terms of trying to establish that. I think that it's actually quite problematic. I think that it's much more likely that there was some sort of, let's just say, supernatural or divine intervention that is not consistent with Christian, or like the standard Christian theology. The reason I say that is partly some of the reasons that sort of Caleb said about Jesus' beliefs about himself, but also the idea, and this is something I didn't mention, but is kind of important to me as well. The idea that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, I think, does not fit well with the Old Testament, and does not fit well with how Jews understand the Messiah. And Christians, of course, have their responses to that. I find them largely ad hoc and post hoc is probably a better way to say it. So I think that this is actually good evidence that Jesus isn't the Jewish Messiah. So it's possible that there could be. I guess what I'm saying is, I think I would be more likely to hold to some sort of supernatural events happening but still not believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah in the way that Christians understand it because of, I mean, I think the atonement doctrine itself is implausible. I also think that it's implausible Jesus was the Jewish Messiah for some of the reasons that I just indicated. There's prophecies that I don't think have been fulfilled. So for reasons like that, like even if I got to the level of, okay, you know, there was some sort of non-natural thing happening, I don't think that I would put the traditional Christian explanation as the next best one. But that's just sort of,
you know, there was a Jewish scholar whose name escapes me at the moment who actually kind of said something similar to that, where he actually believed Jesus was raised from the dead, but he didn't believe he was the Messiah. I think partially because of that. Yeah, I forget his name at the moment, but that's interesting that it kind of parallels what you were saying.
Well, and Muslims actually, they differ a little bit, but generally when I've heard Muslims about this, they'll say that, you know, they think that Jesus was a prophet and that there was a miracle, right? They think that God took him up to heaven or something and made it appear that he died. So the issue there for them is not, and this is actually a point that I like to make. The issue for them is not whether there's a miracle. The issue for them is what theologically would fit. And for them, Jesus being resurrected and, you know, being God and things like that, that doesn't fit with their theology. For them, the idea of atonement doesn't make any sense. They don't feel that God needs to have that in order to forgive. So for them, it's theologically motivated. And this is a point that I sort of make, is that I think that it's a lot of the plausibility comes from what you believe theologically, or atheologically it would be in my case, that's actually driving a lot of it. But yeah, I have a lot of trouble with some of the Christian doctrines underpinning that, which is why I think that I'd find that difficult to put that as a high explanation.
Camel asks, question, why is there no investigation of body theft in Acts? It was a crime under Jewish law.
Yeah, that's a good. By the way, I like how Camille gets all these questions. So I think that's an interesting question. I would say that the closest we get, I'm assuming he's referring to the tribunal that Peter and, is it John or James are thrown in towards the beginning of Acts.
Peter and John.
Think that Peter and John, yeah. I think the closest we get is Peter. I think it's Peter in Acts 2, where he talks about David's body and Jesus' body. He says David's body has been corrupted and is here till this day, but not likewise with Jesus. And so that is, I think, the closest we get to Peter almost inviting people to check out the tomb, which, you know, if the burial by Joseph Arimathea is historical, would not be overly difficult. And if you, like me, think that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre does preserve the spot in which Jesus was originally buried, again, would not be very difficult for people to go check. So that's the case. But as far as the body going missing, that would depend largely on how you take you know, the Matthean narrative in Matthew 28, which most scholars don't think is historical, as far as, you know, the guards forming with the Sanhedrin about the body going missing and so forth. But it also, if you believe that polemic existed, the Sanhedrin didn't, at least by the time Matthew was written, necessarily deny that they didn't know where the body was. So you could maybe count that towards it. But as far as like official inquiry, I don't think they would have been held guilty, because I don't think that they would have necessarily been able to prove that the disciples, in fact, were the ones who stole it. So that would be my speculation. But my short answer to that is, I think in Acts 2, in Peter's sermon, you do see a little hint of that, of him inviting people to go investigate the body. So.
Okay. Also by Camille, I don't know how to pronounce that. And I don't know if it's a man or a woman. He or she asks, do you think there were people who honestly believed they experienced resurrected Jesus having breakfast with them at the Sea of Galilee? Why do you think that?
Is that to me as well? Do I personally think that they did that?
I feel like that makes more sense to me, actually. But
yeah,
because
that's why I was confused.
I think you both could answer. I think you both could answer that if you want.
Honestly believe, yeah. It's like, well, yeah. So he can, yeah. I think that makes more sense for James.
At the Sea of Galilee, so they honestly, I don't know. I don't see that there's any inherent problem with believing that people believing that Jesus had breakfast with them. What I will say is that I just don't accept narratives just because they're presented in the Gospels. So I think it's pretty much impossible to work out what the very early followers of Jesus believed in the immediate days to months following the crucifixion. I think that's lost to history. And I think that even if you ask those people years later, they wouldn't have known, right? Because of the fact that their memories have been reshaped so many times, and it was shaped in the context of how they now understood it. And so, yeah, did some people believe that they had breakfast with Jesus? Maybe, yeah. I think that there's an issue with the location of the appearances. In terms of whether they appeared in Galilee or in Jerusalem, but I don't remember enough about the specifics of that to comment. But I mean, I also don't see the problem with people experiencing Jesus in different locations. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe it happened, but I don't think anything in my account is particularly hinging on it did or did not happen.
Caleb, would you like to respond to this, or do you want me to go on to the next question?
I don't think I have that much to add, other than I don't think we can prove specifically that people at the Sea of Galilee ate with Jesus. I think you can say, all my argument is saying that they probably had some kind of experience like that, and I think the Gospels are consistent with that. That doesn't mean that they are true, but it is at least consistent with it, and it means that we shouldn't necessarily dismiss them. So I don't have a strong opinion on whether that specific narrative is historical. So
okay. This one's from Jerome Daniels, and this one's for you, Caleb. He asks, why should we accept the empty tomb? Why is the empty tomb one of the facts that need to be accounted for?
Yeah, that's a very long answer, because I spend probably 40 pages or so in the book talking about the empty tomb. But essentially, I think that, to give the short version, actually, I kind of like how Dale Allison does it. So, I kind of like how Dale Allison ranks the arguments, because some of them are better than others. But I think the ones that he finds strongest, that I would also find particularly strong, is that the Mark and empty tomb narrative is generally pretty unembellished compared to the later ones. And it's also, even compared to some of Paul's narratives, it doesn't have very much appeals to scripture. It doesn't have very many Christological titles or obvious allusions to the Old Testament, proofs of prophecy, etc. And so these seem very simple and unembellished, and maybe they were embellished on later on. You also see the common argument that, the disciples wouldn't have used women witnesses. And although that depends on the case, because it's not the case that they could never give testimony, certainly it was a bit more tentative as far as the testimony. It would be a lot riskier to use them. So I think that's one of many reasons. I also think, as I've said, I think we have good reasons to think that we probably know where the burial site is, which implies that people would be looking at the grave. And I would say that, although I don't think they would take the body and march it to the streets, that people would, especially during early Christian persecution, at least try to point to the body and say that it was Jesus's. Whether the Christians would have reacted to it in a certain way is something else that could be discussed. But I think that it's probably referenced in Acts 2 and Acts 13, as well as implied in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, because you'd have to ask, if there was no empty tomb, why did Christians in the earliest kerygma even bother mentioning the burial at all? Why not just say he was dead and was raised on the third day? What relevance does the burial even have? And I think if the burial was relevant precisely because that was part of the empty tomb, which is part of their evidence for the resurrection that they pointed to, that just makes better sense than simply, why mention the burial in 1 Corinthians 15, not even mention Pilate, not even mention crucifixion. So the burial was clearly important to the earliest Christians. And when you ask why that is, I think the empty tomb follows from that. So that's just the short version I would give.
Yeah, again, I feel this question could be advanced to me as well, because I assumed the empty tomb. I don't think that those reasons are as persuasive as, well, I'm not sure, as people like Craig, William Lane Craig, and I say that because that's who my book is directed against, right? By the way, Caleb, you mentioned before about marine apparitions. One of the reasons I include them is because I'm pretty sure Craig doesn't countenance them, and that was who it was directed towards. But I take your point that there's other interpretations there. But anyway, sure. the point is that I don't take those arguments as persuasive as people like Craig seem to say that they are. But I don't have a big problem with them either. I think that it's plausible that the tomb was empty. I think that saying a tomb was empty is actually not that. I don't have a big prior against that, because it just doesn't seem that implausible. Also, I think that an interesting argument one can make is that the fact that the tomb was empty can partly explain why the belief in the resurrection came to be the way that it was, right? Because the body was missing. So I actually think there's an interesting way you can argue with that from maybe the other direction. But yeah, I'm not committed to that view. I think that you can still explain what happened without an empty tomb, but I think that things overall fit better with the empty tomb. And so that's one of the reasons I accept it. The other thing that I just want to say is I hate it when debates get all caught up on interpreting precisely the Greek words that Paul chose in that passage and why he doesn't mention the empty tomb, because basically it just all comes down to a question of, well, why would Paul have said exactly this and not that other thing? And I just think that that's a really unhelpful way for the discussion to go. So anyway, yeah, that's one of the reasons that I don't make a big deal of that sort of thing.
Do we have more questions there, Evan?
Yeah, are we about done or what?
Oh, did you miss my question earlier? I don't know what your question was.
Well, see, the answer was probably yes then. So
yeah, so I guess it would be. Yeah.
I think it's a bit rude to use all caps personally. So
It seems a little passive aggressive. Yeah, it does. Evan, do you know if we have any more questions?
I'm not sure if you're muted. I can't hear you, Evan, if you're speaking.
Oh yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to find it. I can't find it. I'm sorry, SlamRN.
Okay.
But there's a lot of comments here, and I can't find it.
I haven't looked at the chat just because we've been focusing on this, so I'm sure it's a joy to look at. YouTube comment sections are always great, but
okay, I'll take one more, and then we will go to the closing statements. Jerome Daniels asks, how many appearances of the resurrection should we accept and why? I don't know who this is directed to, but you can both answer it if you want to.
I'll let James answer that first this time.
I'm not sure how different our answers would be, although we might come to different positions here. But I mean, I don't have a particular view on how many appearances we should accept. I don't accept all the ones as they're told in the Gospels, and I don't think that there's good reason to. Caleb may disagree on that point, but I'm not that interested in arguing it here. I would say that what is reasonable to conclude on the basis of historical evidence is that there were multiple appearances to a range of people. Essentially, when I say a range of people, I'm talking about the disciples and the women followers. Maybe there were some others as well, but specifically those people, and that they believed that Jesus appeared to them in some sort of bodily form. I think more than that is further than I think that you can go on the basis of historical evidence alone, of course. Now, if you have other beliefs about why you think the Gospels are divinely inspired or something, then you might think that there's more that we can say, or you just have a trust in the Gospels and then you believe what they say. But I just say purely on the basis of historical evidence, that's where I end up at, and that's why I treat those as the sort of facts to explain.
My answer would not be that different than what James said. I would probably accept all the ones given in the creed. So that's Peter, the rest of the 12. I would also include Mary in that, even though she's not in the creed. The James, Paul, the 500, and the apostles. I think the hardest ones historically, I'm not saying that I don't personally believe them, but I think it would be difficult, for example, to prove the appearance to Thomas or the Cleopas narrative on the road to Emmaus, or some of the other ones, like maybe some of the ones in Acts, that's like Ananias' vision, which isn't really a resurrection appearance, but some of the ones that are only mentioned once, I think are a bit difficult, that don't come from Paul, where it's not clear where the traditions are coming from. So those are the ones I would be hesitant to say that you can prove historically. But I'm very confident that the apostles, probably Mary Magdalene and Paul, believe they saw Jesus, and I would be fairly confident in also saying that I think something like an appearance to 500 probably occurred. Whether that was some kind of vision in the heavens or something in like Matthew 28 on a mountain, I don't think we know either way. James as well, I would say, also saw Jesus. But I think some of the more ones attested in later Gospels that are not multiply attested, those would be quite difficult to prove historically, or to at least affirm with any degree of confidence historically.
Okay, so let's go to the closing statements.
So we're just going to get 5 minutes to
those. 5 minutes each.
Okay. So I won't take up the whole 5 minutes. So just to wrap up, I think this was a great discussion. James is a great guy, and I really appreciate his work, because I think that his criticisms are some of the best that I've seen in recent scholarship. And I certainly hope that we will maybe get to interact some other time and discuss this. But yes, I would still hold that despite the discussions we've had, that the resurrection hypothesis does have the best predictive power, explanatory power, and explanatory scope. I think that it applies both to the historical evidence and the Recruitus argument as well, that these are best explained by the idea that Jesus is still alive and that he raised from the dead. And although competing hypotheses could technically do this, that they are a bit more speculative and don't have as much explanatory power. And I think that includes ideas like the mutation, resurrection belief, and so forth, which denying certain details in the Gospels makes it a bit difficult to explain why one was done or the other. So although I don't claim that we can know with absolute certainty historically, because history is a very difficult thing to do with any kind of certainty, I think the Christian can at least be warranted in believing that based on the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead and is still currently at the right hand of God. I don't necessarily see that as a method of blind faith. And I believe that in part, I agree with James that this does believe on which worldview you were starting with. But I would also be tempted to say that I think even starting with the opposite worldview, that the evidence is compelling enough to switch someone over to converting. And I think we see that all across the world with people converting to Christianity in similar regards. So I would like to end that and end my opening with that and give it to James.
Yeah, thanks very much, Caleb. I'm grateful for the opportunity, for the invitation from Evan, and for Caleb for the really good discussion. This is one of the better dialogues I've had about this topic, so it was really a pleasure to discuss with someone who's open to looking at other views and acknowledging where their strengths are, and then pointing out where he sees that their weaknesses are. So I think that's where the discussion needs to, or should be going. I guess I'll just reiterate some of the points that I've already made. Again, I'm going to be looking at it obviously from a different perspective than Caleb or perhaps many other people here, in that I'm not coming from a Christian point of view. I'm looking at this from the point of view of an outsider, trying to see what do I think is the best way to understand the events surrounding the death and subsequent appearances of Jesus in a sort of world historical context, in a way that is consistent with my background beliefs, and this also allows me to understand other religious movements and developments. And I guess from my point of view, I see Christianity as remarkable in what happened, but not in such a way that I think it requires a supernatural explanation. I think it fits with other emerging religious movements that we see throughout history and to the present day, other miracle claims, other claims of group religious experiences or paranormal supernatural experiences, which I think can be explained through psychological and sociological phenomena, which I discuss in more detail in my book if you're interested reading up on that. And so I think that those phenomena are sufficient to explain what happened in the case of Jesus. I don't know that we can explain every single detail. Like why did the disciples come to believe that Jesus had been resurrected as opposed to assumed into heaven? I think that if there was any initial reason why the appearances may have been prompted to be more bodily as opposed to divine or transcendent in nature, then that could explain it, but we don't necessarily know exactly why that may have happened. But also, I think that the competing explanation about that God raised Jesus from the dead has a number of issues which mean that I don't find it that plausible. So some of them we sort of touched on and they go outside of the scope of this debate, but like why you would think that God would have a reason to raise Jesus from the dead. Why would Jesus appear to the specific people he did and not potentially people in other countries or, the Roman Senate and so on, if he wanted to vindicate himself? Why is it that Jesus, or how can we understand Jesus being the Jewish Messiah when it doesn't seem to fit the criteria for the Jewish Messiah and other aspects of Old Testament prophecies? Do we expect to see the particular motifs that we see in the Gospels under the resurrection explanation? I'm not sure that you do, unless you sort of already have a lot of Christian theology as part of your background belief. Therefore, I don't find that a very satisfactory explanation. I don't think the facts to be explained follow as a matter of course, as Pierce pointed it out. If you just have the bare facts of God raised Jesus from the dead. So essentially, that's why I don't find this explanation convincing. But I think that just to wrap up there and building on what Caleb said, a lot of this relates to ideas that fit outside of the scope of what we can talk about, like philosophical beliefs and assessment of God's intentions and purposes and so forth. And I think that the debate has to incorporate those ideas and beliefs as well if we're sort of to get anywhere, because otherwise you see a tendency for people to just say the other side is being unreasonable and not listening when, well, sometimes that does happen, of course, but it could just be the case of they're coming at it from a different point of view, and so they don't see it the same way. So I like to hope that we've given a bit of a model for how the discourse can be improved a notch or two. And I hope people found this interesting and enlightening as well. So yeah, thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Caleb and James, for coming on the show and having this spirited debate.
Thank you for inviting us.
Oh, yeah, cheers. I just want to say as well, I'm going to be having an after chat on my channel if anyone wants to join for a bit. Not to trash Caleb or anything. I think that the debate was really good, but just if people want to chat or, I don't know, just a bit of a casual thing. So I stuck a link in the comments, but it seems to have disappeared. But you can also just go to my channel and you should find it appearing there if you want to join in.
He just wants to ring me up with Camille and get it into the line.
And what is the name of your channel?
You can do, just James Fodor.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for watching. I want to give a shout out to my patrons, David Parrish, Brandon Whitaker, Jordan D. Hampton, Nathan Hamilton, Christopher Rogers, Andrew Melnick, Slam RN, Zachary Miller, Steel Cat, Red Blade Flame, and Ron Minton. And if you would like to support this ministry financially, go to www.patreon.com/cerebralfaith. In a few days, this Monday, I'm going to be having Ken Keithley on to talk about Molinism, specifically how it can be applied to soteriology. We're going to be talking about some of the contents of his book, Salvation and Sovereignty, a Molinist approach. So that'll be Monday. I'll put the live stream up ahead of time. If you turn on notifications, it should tell you when the stream is ready and when it's about to go live. So yeah, so come back Monday for interesting discussion on that. Peace out. God bless, and keep using the brains that God gave you.